Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's title, I'll be talking about Dusk Dev David Szymanski's horror-infused navigation simulator, Iron Lung. Join me as I touch on its narrative, gameplay, and overall ambience to answer that burning question. Did Iron Lung leave me breathless, or was this title subpar? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. The stars have burned out, the worlds have faded away. All that limps along is the dredges of starship-bound humanity, scouring the desolate remains of the universe for the means to continue. And yet, the true pioneers are the convicts, sentenced to search these dismal vestiges for any sign of hope. Amongst these, the most recent point of interest is an ocean of blood, discovered on an asteroid. Something which coincides with your punishment as you've been tasked to comb its depths from within a wretchedly cramped submarine that's been welded shut. Narrative-wise, the game wastes zero time in establishing its premise vis-a-vis opening text, and that's honestly fine since once that's out of the way, you're essentially set. Sure, there's an ending sequence and even a single note in the sub for some additional lore, but at the end of the day, Iron Lung is a title that focuses more on the atmosphere it builds up as you experience the journey. So let's get into that, shall we? Because mechanically speaking, this is a bit of an odd duck. See, while the whole navigate the depths of the sanguine sea and photograph points of interest may sound like the foundation for a walking sim, there's a certain complicating factor that led to my classification of this game as a navigation simulator and as a more suspenseful experience overall. And that's the very nature of your vessel. The Iron Lung is essentially a sealed, sea-bound casket, to the point that you're denied a porthole to peer through. That's right, you need to gingerly guide your craft through a series of underwater chasms while blind. Though, that's not to say you're ill-equipped for the task. See, rather than rely on your visual acuity, you're instead provided a pair of distinct tools. The first of these is the map, which provides a fairly accurate representation of the caves, including marked spots where the various points of interest are. Whilst you don't show up on this thing, I did gradually acclimate to the process of figuring out my relative location vis-a-vis my coordinates. Well enough at least that I could successfully navigate towards the various objectives on the map and mark them off. That said, when it came to navigating some of the nastier nooks and claustrophobic corridors, the map leaves a bit to be desired. I'm not kidding when I say the Iron Lung is tantamount to a floating coffin. If you so much as scrape this thing against a wall, it'll breach in a horrifying shriek of steam. Which is where your secondary navigation tool kicks in, the collision sensor. Equally helpful and harrowing, the sensor warns you of any imminent obstacles to your path, pinging with more urgency the closer to an object you get. But that's the thing. When you factor in the fact that the map you've been provided is an approximation and that you sometimes need to intentionally wedge yourself into narrow egresses, there will be times when your path forward is guided not through the absence of a ping, but rather by cautiously orienting yourself in whatever way makes the pinging of your interface a little less furious. Admittedly, this can be a fairly brutal experience at times, especially when you're learning the ropes. And yet, there's certainly a few elements that help to ward off frustration. For one thing, the actual act of turning your sub to orient yourself is, in essence, a gimme. You cannot crash that way, which is incredibly helpful when it comes to turning yourself so you can take photos of the designated area, especially since the game affords you a small margin of error for achieving those objectives. That said, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from just orienting poorly, being an inch from a wall and immediately scuttling the Iron Lung the moment you move. Which is why I'm pretty thankful that there's some fairly forgiving automatic checkpoints, so you don't have to worry too much about oodles of lost progress if your nerves get the better of you or you just make a very poorly gauged gambit. Though, even knowing this, I still stressed a little. That was in large part because the game did a decent job of pulling me into it. This is definitely a game that's partly carried by its ability to create ambience, and on that front, the sound design is on point. While the visuals may be limited to the interior of the sub and the grainy photographs you take of the outside, there's a lot you don't see, but that you hear instead. Some of these things you can readily place, like the constant protests of your iron casket against the pressure of the depths, or the angry pings of the collision sensors. But other things are more difficult to fathom, echoes of which emanate from the macabre hellscape you're floating through. Now, that's the long of my thoughts on this, so it's time to boil things down for the conclusion, and what I'm trying to say is Iron Lung was an interesting experience, a journey which made use of its distinct limitations and relatively simple mechanics to build a tense environment for players to explore, and while it may be narratively light, the journey itself is far from uneventful, an uncanny theme park peppered with small events to keep a traveler enticed during their trip. Admittedly, I've done my best to avoid spoiling these because there is something magical about their spontaneity and the brief bouts of panic that they inspired. I would genuinely recommend this game as a hit, especially if you're a fan of horror games and want something short and atmospheric to chew on. That said, I really should emphasize short, as this does factor in another reason I avoided spoiling some of the meat of the journey. In and of itself, I don't feel this is a bad thing. I clocked in a bit over an hour, and I came away feeling like it was the right length. That said, this was also the sort of title that I wasn't apt to return to given the way it plays out. So ultimately, bear that in mind, but maybe give it a try. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit, my lovely editor Hop. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.